What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Iron Culture presented by Mass. We only have one Eric today. I'll let you decide if that's the best Eric, the worst Eric, your preferred Eric, but we've only got one. But that's okay, because I am joined by my colleague in arms at Mass, not because he has big arms, but because he does have arms. And he brings those arms to the table to welcome Dr. Zac Robinson, and that is Dr. Mike Zourdos, Professor Mike Zourdos, who is leading the charge over at Florida Atlantic University with many awesome researchers and a great lineage of work that's been done there that is being continued now. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. This guest that we have on, though, I've never heard of him. So I've been Googling just before we jumped on here, and I have a whole list of people with a similar name that they don't look like him. So I don't know, maybe you can enlighten me on this guy. Just a little introduction before we jumped on would have been helpful to make sure that I could try to convey some sort of respect for the guest, but it's difficult for me to do that when I don't know anything about the guy. He just seems to have shown up out of nowhere. And now I'm here to actually converse with him for the next, hour? I mean, maybe we can keep this one really short and you can edit this part out and then I can make something up for about 10 minutes. But past that, just a heads up, because I just haven't heard of this guy, Eric.
Oh, that's fair. No, I think that there's two things going on here. One, this is clearly a very, very successful lab because, as we know, as you become more prominent and you become a professor and you move on, that you spend less and less time actually being involved in your own lab. So it doesn't surprise me that maybe you haven't seen the lab even in the lab.
I'm pretty prominent. That is a good description.
Oh, you're prominent. All right.
Yeah.
I will accurately say that. But I think the more disconnected you tend to be from the place that you're supposedly leading in academia, I think that's generally a sign of success. So kudos to you. And I do know, so I think I can give you a little bit of background information. I believe, I don't actually pay attention to this either because I'm also disconnected from anything. I'm just trying to build up, I'm a bodybuilder. Exactly. I'm a bodybuilder. Not much more than that. But I did get a PhD so that I could be very successful on social media. I've heard that is actually the best way to become successful on social media is just spend 10 to 12 years, not having the time to do it, to get a title, and then you will blow up. That is what I've heard. So anyway, I did that and still following that model. And I was on Zac Robinson's master's and PhD committees, supposedly.
How do you do?
You know what? I think I passed him, but I also know that I was only some part of the vote. You were leading the committee. Yeah, I believe so. And I think he's been basically running your labs for the last few years. So maybe a thank you.
Seems like it's going well.
I mean, I would say so.
Yeah.
You guys are publishing stuff. You're getting prominence.
Well, keep. Did he graduate? Is it doctor? Did he graduate yet?
He is a doctor. Yes.
Okay, Dr. Roberson, if you could keep that going, that'd be great. It sounds like it'd be good for all of us. I appreciate this, Eric. I have a little bit more respect for this guy now, and we'll ask him some questions about some things that he's done. The lots of things. I have a whole list of the science and the lifting questions, and I think it looks very great over here. So many things. So I'm excited to talk about it.
No, I tell you what. On paper, he is looking fantastic. He's got the doctorate. More importantly, though, I believe he's been on Iron Culture at least 3 times. I do lose track after a certain point because the guests to me are just stepping stones that I actually envision it in my head. I think of either their heads or their backs, and maybe because sometimes I like to think about stepping on their back while they kind of look up at me with this like a reverence and also like you're hurting me, and I go yes, I take pleasure in this. So like I'm either stepping on their backs or the head, but So that after the third time, they've helped me rise to prominence enough that I would say I appreciate them and I start to notice their existence more. So two things to congratulate Dr. Zac Robinson on is one, not only do I actually see you, which I would say is something that you're honored to acknowledge. But secondly, and more seriously, and we can move into the post-banter phase of Iron Culture now, it's awesome to have you back on specifically today to discuss the fact that you've now pre-printed and submitted your principal dissertation work from your PhD, which honestly, now I'm going to be serious. Myself and Dr. Zourdos, I would say we were both honored and privileged to be a part of and to provide the guidance we could, but to watch you flourish into the extremely capable doctoral student and then graduate and now active researcher that you are, who is taking the field further than I would say either one of us could have on our own with the things that you've learned and the extremely grueling process that you had to go through to get this paper out there. So welcome once again to the hallowed halls of Iron Culture. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I didn't want to take that banter phase off the rails too much. That was some good content there. But no, genuinely, this goes without saying before we even start talking about everything. PhD journey would not have been possible without either of you guys, as well as the other members of my committee. In addition to all of the members of the Muscle Lab, we'll talk about, the primary project for my PhD. That was a lot of work, and not only for me throughout the process, but it was definitely not possible without an awesome team that I was fortunate enough to be a part of, that both of you were also, guiding me along the way. So I appreciate you, appreciate the rest of the committee, and also the entire Muscle Lab team. Want to make sure I get that on the front end. Definitely a team effort for sure.
Yeah. And in all seriousness, I was making fun of Zourdos for not being involved. But to be clear, the Muscle Lab was instrumental for me for doing my work to get my PhD in 2016 when I was out there. And I could say it's a unique environment in the best of ways. It's a collaborative learning environment, and it is a fun, if not, it's a fantastic balance between we have fun, we connect, but it is also business time, because I was in that lab for, I think our first participant started at 5:15 and our last one started at 6:15 p.m. And I was there until I got elbow tendonitis and got specifically taken aside saying you need to not come in quite as much. And I took that too literally and actually had the audacity to celebrate my wife's birthday. And she visited and we went to Disney World. And then I got made fun of the whole time. So I'm like, I don't understand. What am I supposed to do? And I said, oh, I see. I'm supposed to get made fun of. That is also a wonderful part of this lab, which I know that tradition still carries. And a big part of that is because of Dr. Zourdos' leadership, which I know he wants to make a joke now, but I just want to say that he's created something awesome. So,
well, I appreciate that. But it's one of those things when, you're coming in too much and then somebody says, hey, you should take, come in a little bit less, where someone's just being polite, Eric. You don't actually do it, right? They just want to, it's another test to see. And then they come in the next day and you don't show up till 9 a.m. and they're like, oh, he actually did it? That's not how this is going to work, right? We're going to be here all day, every day. No, it's an amazing place, but it's the whole team that makes it work and makes it run. We've had so many phenomenal students over the years, other people that have supported the lab from the outside, and the people that come in. And what's so cool about it is, and I'm sure Zac can attest to this, because, Zac's one of those guys that just won't leave. Sometimes you watch, if there's any college basketball fans out there, a guy has been in the starting lineup since he was a freshman and he comes back as a senior and you're like, he's still here? Like he just keeps showing up. And so Zac has just kept showing up for 6 years now almost. And, but every era of the lab is different. We have different people. We have a little bit of a different workflow. We have our projects. Zac and I talked about this not too long ago. I believe strongly that the highest quality work of what we've ever done is occurring right now in the muscle lab. And that's a testament to everybody always raising the bar and getting better and better and better. But
And you said that over multiple years, which is a great sign. You haven't had periods where you're like, really phoned it in the last couple of years. It's always been progressing in that way.
It has been, and it's a testament to these students, these men and women that come to the lab and do such a great job. And but I said this to Zac not too long ago. There's something about the magic of the early years, when I'm 26 and my students are like 24, and they're like, "Do you know what to do?" I'm like, not really, but we'll figure it out, and
let's do it.
Yeah, we're done collecting data at 11, and we sleep in the back of the lab and wake up at 4, and we train, and then we have subjects coming in at 6 or whatever it might be. And but it's just such a fun time, and just have such a good crew of people. And that's what it's all about, Eric. With the students that you have, and Zac, and everything that you've done, it's just all about the people. And the people that come in work hard. They do things the right way. They're kind people. They're people of integrity. And that's just what we pride and build ourselves on. So it is such a pleasure to do that and to be around that for so many years. So thank you to everybody that's been part of it. And the two of you are obviously at the forefront of that. But today we are going to talk about Dr. Robinson's dissertation. And so the title of this, "The Effect of Resistance Training Volume on Individual Level Skeletal Muscle Adaptations, a Novel Replicated Within Participant Unilateral Trial." Now, one correction, Eric, Zac and I, everybody, and yourself, who's a co-author on this, pre-printed it. You said it was in review. It was promptly rejected. And so
we didn't get to bring that up. Yeah,
it was promptly rejected. And so,
well, hold on, Zac. Have you resubmitted it yet, Zac?
I texted you this morning, and I said go. And I text you this morning at like 4 a.m. or something. And I was like, go ahead and move it forward.
Yeah. I will probably later today or tomorrow. Yeah.
Okay, so it's technically not in review. Yeah. Okay. Wow. Look.
Yeah. And so it was promptly rejected. But there's a lot of words in that title, and Eric, I'll stop in a moment because I don't know if you want to make sure you have any setup on this before I kind of get into it. But I just want to say that I said not too long ago when our lab mate Josh Pelland, who has been on this podcast, released his meta-regression from our lab, which is currently in review and is pre-printed, that was the highest quality piece of work I've ever seen. Well, this is right along with that, and I think this may be the highest quality piece of work that I've ever seen that Zac did here. And I just want to state before we give it to Helms for some more intro on this and set this up, that and I'm interested to hear this from Zac today, the journey that Zac went on with this, the independence that he went on with this, the statistical modeling that he went on with this, the openness that he went on with this, because his opinion and hypothesis was not originally what the tentative conclusions or tenuous conclusions, I would say, that we'll make from this paper. And so it's just a lesson in how to go about things the right way, and looking at it and just truly seeking out how to do the most possible robust study that he could. And it was a great study, a great job. We've even received an unsolicited email already, Zac, from somebody that we look up to that was kind of praising the methods that you went by. And so I think it's very, very cool. So Eric, I'm sure you want to have a little bit of lead in here to talk about what this is, and then we'll kick it to the man over here to take us through it.
No, I think that's great framing. And I think where I want to start this is how work builds upon prior concepts. And I remember that if you were to read the introduction to my PhD, I specifically talk about the rationale for why I wanted to study autoregulation. Came from my coaching experience and also my read of the scientific literature. And it was specifically that papers like Hubel, 2005, observed huge amounts of variability in terms of the hypertrophy response and cross-sectional area of the biceps, as well as the 1RN changes over the first 12 weeks of people training. And that, other studies like Timmons would quantify certain physiological differences that may be the reason for these large discrepancies in responses with hyper-responders, non-responders, etc. And what we observe as coaches, which we have all done, and which Zac is, actively doing at Data-Driven Strength in parallel to also doing scientific work, is that certain people seem to respond far better than others, which, as we'll learn, that might be real, but our narratives as to why they do may or may not be in all cases. And more importantly, that if that introduction that I wrote today, I would probably have to write it a little bit differently if I wanted to be entirely scientifically accurate. And that's a realization I've only had and been able to even understand through Dr. Robinson's dissertation work in the last couple years, in that the classical way that we have tried to identify individual responsiveness and explaining that variance and attributing it to certain individual different factors at baseline is potentially lacking and needs to be done differently. And I think we're at a crossroads in sports science where we have to ask, what's our purpose? And the purpose that I was trying to enter into and step into when I did my autoregulation PhD was saying, hey, it's great that we have all this stuff that is for, group averages and describing the typical response. But what we need to move to, what the frontier of the future is actually figuring out how do we take a data-driven, scientific approach to training the individual, figuring out what they respond best to, and customizing and personalizing training. And we've seen that notion is only expanded. Now we have personalized nutrition. We have big data and AI as tools that propose to be able to do this for you, whether it's for health, fitness, or performance. And this is exactly what the sports scientist is chasing. This is what colleagues of ours like Mike Tuchscherer are doing with emerging strategies. And the question that I've actually had to re-ask is, but is that actually the best use of our time? Can we do that in any logistically feasible manner? And is that the role of sports science? Or perhaps, maybe, and I've gone back on this now, the role of sports science is to better understand the relationships between all these variables and maybe leave that approach to what's going on in the trenches, if done right, because of what we've learned from Dr. Robinson. And the cool thing, like you said, Mike, and I'm not going to explain this for Zac, but I think Zac actually probably went into his PhD with a similar desire that I had with autoregulation, but just going, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And then we all looked down and went, we're not standing on the shoulders of giants. We're standing on a card house and someone's going to blow on it and we're all going to fall down. So with that lead in, Zac, how accurate am I? What did you go into your PhD trying to do, seeing, and what inspired it? What previous work, like I kind of led into my PhD, was motivating you to ask the questions that you asked in your doctoral work?
That is an absolutely fantastic way to frame it. I think that when I kind of look back on this journey, that's exactly how I think about it, is like very much like you said, Dr. Helms, I wanted to say, okay, the number one critique you're going to hear of research for people in the trenches, and obviously all of us are very, involved in that space. I'm still a coach, and that is ultimately how I frame the way that I ask questions. Is what am I seeing in my own training? What am I seeing in the training of the people that I coach? And how do I optimize those processes with a scientific lens to make those things better? And so the number one response you're going to get from anybody that is maybe less kind of coming from the the evidence-based kind of sphere is like, well, yeah, but the number one limitation every time you guys talk about research is, it's just an average. It's just the the population average. This doesn't apply to an individual. And so from my perspective, I was like, well, at the end of the day, then that's effectively useless. And if research is not useful from that perspective, I don't want to put more resources into doing research that isn't useful for the applications that I care about. And so that is 1000% the mental headspace that I came into this from. And so the rationale of this project is very much in line with the way that you would have wrote an introduction. And I can still remember the 700 drafts of this, of the proposal that I sent to you guys initially, and all these kind of things that I have. Hubel, Erskine, Demas, Hammerstrom, all of these papers that are very commonly utilized to say, guys, look, the variability here is extremely clear. That's not that we're past that. That's not the concern anymore. What we're really concerned about is how do we identify these individuals from baseline to make sure that they're getting the most efficacious training prescription as fast as possible. And that's where my focus was entirely. So before we kind of get into the study design, I think it's just important to kind of come at it from that perspective. Is like, that is my framing. That always has been my framing, is like, I'm thinking about this from a practitioner's lens, a lifter's lens. I'm like, at the end of the day, what I want to do is give people the most effective training possible. It's not from a what's good enough perspective, what is an effective way to prescribe training to a population, like health guidelines. That's not where I'm coming at this from. I'm coming at this from somebody who's in the trenches, and I want to make sure I can optimize the training prescription from an individual level. And I think that's important to realize and just understand. I didn't come in with this with some sort of bias that I would later influence my conclusions. If anything, it'd be the opposite. And so that was the kind of mental framing in which I designed the study. So I don't know exactly what order you guys think is the best to kind of go through kind of the design of the study. But I guess to me, the number one thing that's kind of important to understand is just the limitations of our observations in general. So the way that I've been kind of workshopping, trying to explain this, is that take any study that you're reading and you're looking at individual data points. I like to think of what we're actually observing there is the combination of a bunch of ingredients in like a big pot. So think of like a cauldron, like a witch's brew kind of situation. There are all of these ingredients exactly that go into this pot, that ultimately when you see data on a plot, or you're looking at individual level data that we actually observed and collected, all you're getting to do is tasting the final product. You're not seeing the ingredients that are actually going into the pot. And so what that's representing is that when we see variation in data, just like there are multiple causes for things that we can see in terms of mean changes, there are multiple causes that can lead to variation. And so ultimately, when we're designing a study, we go through, really rigorous methods to try to design the study to isolate that change between groups that would, a mean change that you would typically design a study for. And in this case, the same thing had to be done to isolate that variation between the different training protocols. So it's kind of just shifting the thing that we care about from this mean difference between two groups to the variability that we see with an intervention. And so within that kind of pot that we're ultimately only getting to taste the final product, there's a couple things that are important to realize that go into that equation. The first of them is kind of the whatever ingredient you really want to taste. That is the true individual variability. That is the representation that a characteristic of Eric Helms makes him responsive to this given training program, and it may be different for me and it may be different for Dr. Zourdos. Ultimately, there is that component of the variability that goes into the pot. But there are also these other sources of variability, again, that are not necessarily caused by the training intervention, that also get added into this pot. This is where things like measurement error get factored in. So anytime you take a measurement, obviously, anyone who's ever done that, there's human error associated with that, and that's going to lead to variability between measurements completely independent of the true value. If I measure your quad size 100 times in a row on the same day, the true value of your quad isn't changing, but I'm still going to have variability in those measurements. That's one source of variation. So that's another ingredient that kind of gets added to the pot. The other one that is typically not really accounted for in our typical study designs is what's called biological variability. And so biological variability is essentially the natural fluctuations that we get in some sort of measurement over time due to all of the other factors that are going to influence this. This is where things like stress, nutrition, just literal fluctuations in nutrition status and swelling maybe in your ultrasound measurements, all the other sources of variability that kind of can fluctuate day to day. That's the other source that also gets thrown into this pot. And then finally, you have sampling variance, which you guys have talked about multiple times on the show at this point, when we're taking a small subset of the potential measurements from a population or from an individual. Some of that selection of bias can occur and kind of produce some variability purely because we're not getting the entire possible sample of whatever we're trying to measure. And so all of those additional sources of variation get thrown into this pot. And as I said at the very beginning, the only thing we get to observe is that final recipe, that final taste. We have no idea the components that are actually thrown into this pot. So if anybody's ever tried to do like a blind taste test, or you can go watch these on YouTube, where they'll take master chefs or people with extremely refined palates and try to get them to rank different ice creams. Sometimes they'll end up picking the one from Walmart to be 5 stars, and vice versa. The extremely decadent, rich, high quality ice cream gets ranked, oh man, this sucks. That happens sometimes. And that's kind of the experience here, is that when we don't really know what sources of variation are getting dumped into this pot when we're observing the data, we can't really say what is the cause of the variability that I'm observing. And that's kind of the foundational component of the realization that, hey, when we only observe the variation and we're not trying to isolate its causal nature, then it's kind of difficult to say what is actually driving that variability in the first place. And so that is where, you know, there's a whole gamut of different ways you can try to attack that question. But I think that's kind of the first important place to start, is just understanding that kind of conceptual nature. But I don't know if you guys want to hammer that home or have anything to build off there first.
I think that's really good. And just to kind of lay this out even more practically for what everybody probably sees. Typically, what Zac's getting at is, we see some of these studies that have been mentioned before that are off-cited for the, let's say, individual response variation. You'll see what's called a waterfall plot. And so in a waterfall plot, you'll have, an X and Y axis. And in that X axis, you'll have the participant number. So participant 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then on the y-axis, let's say you have percentage change in muscle thickness or cross-sectional area. And then what you'll see that starting all the way on the left, you'll have, some people that dip below the line, that's sort of negative change in muscle size. And some people all going to the right that are way above the line, that have huge changes in muscle size. And then it'll be said, all right, and to bring in Zac's point now, if you don't know everything that goes into the pot and what's accounting for that, but what's often said is, see, this person responds to this training not as well, and this person responds to training much better, so low and high responders. And that's one way to look at it, right? Do people respond differently to training in general? And then you might have another study or protocol that has manipulates a training variable. Zac used volume in his study. So we'll use that here, and we'll say, all right, in this study, there were, 15 sets, 25 sets, and 40 sets of volume per week. On average, the 40 sets were the best. However, if we look at this, somebody in the 15 set group actually had the greatest gains in the entire study. They respond better to low volume. Somebody in the 40 set group had the worst gains in the whole study. Their BI probably respond better to doing lower volume as well, whereas other people respond better to doing higher volume. And we call that the kind of more specific or condition-specific variation. So we're talking about two types of ways people talk about variation, right? Which is to say, hey, we have some people just in general have high or low responders, and then some people may respond better to this manipulation of training variables. And are either one of those the case when we think about what Zac is saying? Well, how about all of these other factors, whether it's nutrition, whether it's stress, whether it's whatever's going on in their life, whether it's sleep, whatever it might be that could impact what's going on. It could be that somebody just simply responds better to training or responds to this type of volume. It could be that they just didn't sleep, that sort of thing. But what's important is that the way those studies were designed, and this isn't attacking anyone, because I, for years, was very guilty of this. And Zac, I don't know if you remember this. I have a video in the Mass Research Review, if you've heard of that publication. It's very good, very prominent. Has another prominent guy that I work with in there. And that's on individualization. And I remember some years ago, you said something to me to the effect of, I've watched that video many times. And I cited all of these studies we were talking about. And what those studies don't do is we found out, or I should say you found out, that they weren't actually investigating this question appropriately to be able to make this determination. It doesn't mean, and I'm not saying here that this or that is the reason for this variability. That variability we see where we have data points going all over the place in the study, those are real, right? The variability is real. That's occurring. That occurs in every study, right? I'm shocked if we do a study and the muscle growth is uniform. I'm shocked if we do a study and in terms of strength, one person doesn't stay exactly the same or even decrease strength, right? That variability is real, but why is it happening? And can we determine that happening? And then how did we need to design a study to actually detect it? And then what can we say from that? And so I think, Zac, unless Eric has anything to add, a good place to take it is, what did you need to change to be able to actually examine if that general, are there high or low responders, or condition, do some people respond better to high or low volume types of variation, exist? And then I would like to hear after that, the which I think is important, a difference between a long-term response variation and then a baseline difference, right? Because there are differences between people, right, that aren't responses. And I think it's important to delineate between those. So I'm sure Eric's going to chime in, but after that, what did you need to change about the study design to actually answer these questions? And then what did you find there?
Yeah, let's. I think that's perfect framing, Mike. But let's take this one step at a time. I think we've got a pretty savvy audience. They've been educated around this, and I think some of the things that they're already going to be flagging are I get it. Like if you just compare three groups, and then there's some people who seem to respond better, even than the low volume group, different than the average. Well, okay, I get what you're saying, why that might be something unique to them or unique to their environment, but we have ways of doing that, and some of these studies you've cited have already solved that. Hey, what about a within participant design? Doesn't that control for all of those factors that would be, the same within a person? Because my leg, last time I checked, is attached to the same brain and the same stomach as the rest of my body. So, boom, sleep taken care of, nutrition taken care of, or heck, couldn't we just do a crossover and then just look at that? And if I respond better, it'll show up in one, but not the other. So I think from a kind of a questioning standpoint, I'd like to have you address Mike's question, Zac. Aren't crossovers and within participant designs sufficient to help us determine the difference between these two types of variability that Dr. Zourdos was getting at?
Yeah, so as you said, those designs are awesome, and they've done a really good job at helping us better isolate different research questions in our field for a variety of different things. And I think they're extremely, extremely powerful for a lot of questions. The challenge comes in when you're essentially not allowing us to separate one of these sources of variation that kind of clouds things together. So it's just the most basic example I can kind of think of is, in a within participant design, as you're saying, you have your right leg doing high volume, your left leg is doing low volume. So throughout that training period, it's the same nutrition, the same stress, the same sleep, these kind of things. So in theory, those are all controlled for. However, the problem is when I only have a single observation for that individual, you are making the assumption that all variation that they have from the mean is because of true individual differences, rather than these random fluctuations that can occur if I were to have that person complete the same training program 100 times in a row. There's going to be variability there as well. And so essentially what you're doing with the design that we ended up going with is what you have to do is any design that allows you to isolate whatever comparison you want to make. So for the within participant design, the thing that allows you to do is within the same individual, I can compare high and low volumes. So that's obviously vital. If I want to say, does the difference between the volume conditions, does that vary from person to person? I first have to allow for the comparison to occur. The second component of it, though, is to say, what is their true variation from the mean? And really the only way you can do that is by having more than one observation for an individual to determine what is their true variation that they ultimately have from whatever population estimate that we're gathering. So essentially, by replicating the same design, you're isolating the true individual differences from these other sources of variation. The major one here is biological variability, where again, if I was just to have somebody repeat the same high volume training program 100 times in a row, there's obviously variation that can occur there. And so if I only have one observation for this person, there's no way to say, are they truly responding differently? Or is it just because they happen to be on this side of the mean this time that I measured them? So really the only way you can do that is through replication of the training intervention.
Gotcha. So to put this in kind of very, very practical terms that a coach would understand, I have you do this training protocol. I have you repeat this training protocol a year from now, but now you have a newborn. You're probably not going to respond the same way. And also, you've also advanced as a lifter, right? So if the person is then scientifically informed, they go, okay, so even if we had one of your limbs do high volume and one of your limbs do low volume in both of those conditions, your limbs would respond to potentially different magnitudes, right? And then we go, okay, well, so I guess we would need to do a crossover and a within participant design. And we're starting to get closer to what you actually did. So can you walk us through kind of this logical train of why we eventually had to do what you did of a within participant design crossover with replication, which I think that last little bit of why it needs to be replicated is probably something that the average person would struggle to understand. And I say that being generous, calling myself an average person, because I struggled to understand that when we all sat down and worked through the potential methods that you would use.
Yeah, it honestly, in a audio medium, it is pretty challenging. I think the visual component of this is extremely helpful. But ultimately, the reason that you need to essentially replicate the design is, I like to think about the first part of the design. Let's consider that. The first part of the design is trying to get the value that we need for each participant. And so that's where we need a crossover design or a within participant design to be able to compare the different volumes for the given participant. But after that, we need to replicate it, because then we really want to see what is that individual's quote unquote true value relative to the overall mean. And in order to do that, you have to have more than two values to essentially calculate variation for an individual. And so that way you're able to separate these confounding sources of variation like measurement error, biological variability, and sampling variance from the true individual differences. And so once you do that, then we can say, okay, now we're more confident what this individual's true difference between high and low volumes is. Then we can say, okay, what is the true distribution of those differences? And then we can say, what is the real amount of variability that we're actually observing? And I think maybe a helpful way to, a simpler example to kind of demonstrate this too, is just the most basic comparisons that we have on this. If there was a lot of variability that we're seeing in response to a training intervention, if we have a simple RCT that's looking at a group that's resistance training and a non-training control group, essentially what you would expect to see is that because the intervention is causing additional variability and maintains all the other sources of confounding variation, biological variability, measurement error, sampling variance, all those are maintained in comparison to the control group, you would expect that the resistance training group would have additional variation. And that tends not to be what we actually see. And there's limitations to the study design, so I'm not going to hammer too much on them. But that is kind of a design that exists across multiple domains of research, where there are multiple outcomes, different fields and stuff, where they are comparing the variation between intervention groups and the placebo or the control conditions. And if you are going to see true variation, you would expect additional variation in the intervention groups, and more often than people would likely expect, that doesn't tend to be the case. And so essentially what replication is doing is we're taking that one step further to allow us to assess that on the individual level, and kind of filtering out these other sources of variation that could be clouding the picture from what we really want to know.
So by layering in these different elements, crossover within participant design and then replication, you're able to isolate the different sources, or at least quantify the magnitude of variation in different ways. And so we have essentially the ability with this design to say, do individuals vary generally in response to an intervention? And in yours, we had two different conditions, a higher and a lower volume condition. And then do they respond in a systematically consistent way to one of those two conditions? So individual response variation. So to put this in real simple terms, do you just grow better when you lift than somebody else? And then the other question is, are you a quote unquote Jeff Alberts or an Eric Helms? If that is even a thing, or can we tell it's a thing? And ultimately, we also have to acknowledge that conceptually, the way this design enables us to look at it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is essentially comparing the sizes of these variances, not saying that one may or may not exist, but if one type of variance is larger and completely subsumes another type of variance, we can say it's not observable at the very least, and then we can make some inferences about how meaningful that variance is. So if gross variability completely subsumes individual variability, within the constraints of our sample size, we can say, hey, this is not a major player that should be dictating whether or not we step into higher or lower volumes. And that's a seed I'm planting for what does all this mean, and we won't get there yet. But I think we've now understood that by the design you utilized, a within participant crossover that was then replicated with two different conditions for each limb of using higher and lower volumes, we're able to isolate these sources of variability to make determinations as to whether there are differences between individuals' general responsiveness to resistance training, and then was there actual differences in how they responded in a repeatable manner to different levels of volume. Do I have that right, Zac?
Yeah, you have it as right as you can. It's a lot, but yeah, it's a challenging thing to sort through. But that's exactly the different kind of components of the results. So ultimately, the findings that we ultimately took for each outcome is I like to break them down into kind of three kind of areas, as it helps to understand things as best as we can. So like you said, we kind of have these two bigger kind of domains. The one is, do I grow more than my best friend? And the other one is, am I Eric Helms or am I Jeff Alberts? That's kind of our two distinct domains. Within each of those, there's kind of three components that kind of help us paint the entire picture. And so we'll start with, do I grow more than my friend, right? Ultimately, for that one, we saw that when I take your response in terms of how much did you grow in the first part of the design and how much did you grow in the second part of the design, those tended to trend or correlate pretty well. And so essentially what that's saying is the amount that I grow is relatively repeatable, it's predictable, and it's something that seems relatively stable from occasion to occasion when I'm measuring it. And so that generally would support the idea that there is some true variability that we're picking up on with respect to, just in general, are my genetics making me grow more than someone else in this kind of design. The one note I will say that for the absolute methodological purists, which I can totally appreciate, we didn't have a control group in this study, so we can't entirely say that the changes that we're observing are because of the actual training intervention. But when looking at the data that we do have, the differences between just a resistance training change or resistance training minus control change is somewhere between 0.9 and 0.95. So it's kind of a unique case where the resistance training is a relatively unpolluted change that we can be relatively confident in. So I put that in there just to cover my bases, but I don't think it's a huge concern. So long story short,
say that for a philosophical purist too, the way you framed that, based on, genetics, this person might respond better than that. We can't even actually say that when we really think about it. All we know is that in whatever cluster of things makes up your response is systematically repeatable. So it could be that maybe your genetics are not better. It's just that you actually live, and this sounds terrible as my analogy is coming out, and I'm going to go with it. You live in an area with a tremendous amount of pollutants, and you're actually going to get cancer and die in 10 years, and your response to everything just sucks. And the other person does not, even though you might actually have Ronnie Coleman genetics. But we won't know that until, you start getting tumors everywhere. And again, very morbid. And I'm glad I stuck with it because it just, there's no reason for me to have done that. But whatever creates this systematic response to resistance training generally, whether it's genetics or environment, we don't know, is resulting in a repeatable, correlatable response that we would anticipate independent of the specifics of the intervention. Is that an accurate framing?
That's money. And you can see just like even for all of us who are familiar with this topic, it's so easy to let the tongue slip and make that slight misallocation of something. In reality, what our design is doing is you can think of the variability as a big Venn diagram, essentially, is what we're trying to do, is we're trying to separate the two things, two parts of this variability. We have the variability induced by the training intervention. That's what we care about. And this entirely other part of the Venn diagram, which is everything else. And so I just attributed that to genetics because I think that's a relatively likely candidate, but that is an assumption. And so that's an important, that's a very important distinction. So yes, the other sources of variation seem to be something that we can predict in respective of, or irrespective of. So it's a stable response that we can predict. The second piece of that is we also assess the quote unquote agreement of these responses. And so essentially what we were trying to do here is, like you said, is we have these two aspects of the Venn diagram. What are we looking at in terms of magnitudes when we compare them? And while this is absolutely, to some degree a subjective endeavor, one could I think make a reasonable position that if the true variability is less than the variability that kind of naturally occurs to this fluctuation in terms of magnitude, it's not a massive something that should be dictating your practice necessarily. Now, again, if you want to make the position that it is non-zero and I want to change my practice in some way about that, absolutely, you could. But that is kind of was the next step. And so when we looked at the meaningfulness of the variability, it definitely trended in the direction of being larger than the other sources of variation. So the non-variation that we care about, but it wasn't 100% clear across our set of analyses. So I definitely view it as kind of a hat tip in that direction. I think the overall picture there is detecting some signal, but I'm sure we'll talk on this again, but we have a very, very low sample size for this type of research. We have a pretty solid sample size in respective to our field for detecting the kind of typical things that we care about in terms of the differences in means. But as far as variation, that takes much larger sample sizes. So I always take these results with a pretty big grain of salt. But ultimately, that is what we found for the kind of the general response variation there. In the second half of things, so ultimately, do I respond better to higher or low volumes? That's where the picture essentially flips. And so the reliability of those responses in terms of the difference between high and low volume in the first kind of phase and the difference between high and low volume in the replication attempt, those didn't tend to correlate nearly as strongly or weren't nearly as reliable. And when we look at the agreement of those, they favored the kind of the confounding sources of variation as opposed to the true individual differences. Now, again, that's not to say that the true individual differences was zero. It's just saying that the other sources of variation seem to be the predominant one. And so ultimately, to put it in very simple terms, what the results of our study tended to show is that there was more evidence of I respond better than my friend on average than the alternative of the principle of is higher or lower volume better for me. Didn't seem to be something that had a strong source of true individual differences. And it's obviously important to note, and we're kind of doing this out of order, is that on average, on the group level, the higher volume condition for our primary outcome was tended to be superior. So on the group level, higher volumes were more efficacious for hypertrophy, but not for strength. On the individual level, that didn't seem to be something with a ton of true quote unquote variation.
Gotcha. So we've got this study design where I think it needs to be emphasized. You had to bring these people in. They did a within participant study, which is a study in and of itself. Which is hard, right? I've run training studies, and then you said, "Cool, we're going to bring you back. We got to flip those limbs." And they're like, "Okay, got a washout period." So now it's a within participant crossover. And they went, "Oh man, I trained." I did a washout, came back, trained again. Then you went, okay, now we got to do that whole thing again. Now,
so they did two phases. I just want to be clear. I mean, maybe that wasn't totally
you
clarified.
Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah. So they did the first within participant design, washout, and then they have to come back. So it's only two phases of training. Just making that clear.
Yes. So I think I actually made it sound like four. I didn't mean to.
Yeah.
But
yeah. I know
I was trying to.
It just. Yeah. I got you.
Yeah, I was trying to. I realized the way I phrased that. I was trying to emphasize just how much of a big deal this is, not only on your time but also the participant time, and that's important because of the framing we had earlier of what is the role of sports science. And I think when someone who actually has conducted research has looked at this paper, they're going to go, "Oh, hold the phone." Especially if they're in a typical university research environment where this is done with predominantly university students in the constraints of semesters, when you have research assistants, people in the lab, and all the logistics are lined up in your favor. And we're not typically operating in an environment where we're doing a hospital-based study with external grant funding, NIH funding, although that there's the conversation to be had there as to, how stable that even is and how good it is for those folks. So it makes you go, hold on, like, wow, even if I did want to do what I am now starting to question was the role of sports science, the logistical feasibility of being able to do what I think you've so eloquently explained is necessary to tease out the differences between individual response variability to a condition and individual response to an intervention generally really starts to chip away at the idea that that's what, at least at this stage of sports science and the way things are conventionally done, what we should be doing. Now, with that said, I think people are going to have some questions about some of the limitations of the way you conducted this. So what kind of sample size are we talking about here? And how long were they being observed? These are the two oft-cited issues that people have. Very valid concerns about research. And to in your mind, do they invalidate what you found? Or, I mean, that's another thing you see on the internet, is people, they find a limitation, and depending upon their biases, they use that limitation to poison the well or throw the baby out with the bathwater, rather than doing something sensible like, I don't know, figuring out how the limitations maybe limit the conclusions that could come from it, rather than just going, let me kick over the apple cart.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. Like, I think the chief limitations were definitely our sample size. So we had 16 participants, recreationally trained participants, that completed the within participant design. So we're talking 32 limbs. And those 32 limbs completed that training program twice. So essentially 64 different limbs that were observed for the training intervention. Now, for the kind of the group level effects, I think that's pretty good. I think that is for detecting the differences in the means. If you saw within subject design, essentially with an N of 32, that's pretty good. But for detecting variability, I would be lying if I said that's not woefully inadequate. And so that ultimately the goal of this project for me was less about what we found and more about demonstrating what is conceptually necessary, the resources that would need to be poured into it to do that on a large scale, and then ultimately demonstrating how I was wrong. And it's mostly an ode to previous me of saying this variability that we believe we are attributing to true individual differences may not necessarily be the case. And that's, to me, that is the primary chief finding of the study, is not necessarily making bold attributions on exactly how much variability there is, those kind of things, because frankly, N of 16, that is very challenging to make strong claims about those things. But what I think it does a good job of is demonstrating that, okay, I see this gross variability, and we tried to replicate all of the plots from a lot of these papers that I previously cited as very strong evidence of true individual response variation. And you see the differences relative to measurement, and we tried to replicate all of those things to show, look, we can produce the exact same things, but then when we go through the formal process of trying to decompose all these sources of variation, it's not really coming in all cases from where you think it is. And so to me, it's more so a, hey guys, caution flag. When we interpret this from now on, we need to be aware of these things, and that it can be strongly clouding our ability to detect these things. That's to me, that is the main limitation, and one I'm really confident in, because we were able to validate it not only with some of the examples in our data, but also some simulations that we did as well, to just kind of demonstrate this isn't an artifact of our data set, and more so something that kind of exists as kind of a broad understanding. So that's kind of, to me, that is the chief finding, and is less limited because we tried to account for that in multiple different places. Now, in terms of taking the study at face value, how much does this apply? The multiple things that you mentioned, like I already mentioned, the sample size is very low and for variation, and so that is something I take completely head on, and I think that's a very valid point to raise. The next one would be the length of the training intervention. So each individual phase was 11 weeks long, if I remember correctly. So we essentially had individuals come in, we characterized their pre-training volumes, and we kind of went back and forth on how we wanted to handle that when we were designing the study. Ultimately, what we had them do is a 2-week familiarization period where they trained with a little bit lower volumes than they would in the intervention period. So everyone was increasing post this familiarization period by approximately 25%. And so they went into kind of the main training period. Again, overall, that lasted around 11 weeks, entered a 6 to 8 week washout period where they went back to their habitual training. And then they entered the second 11-week phase where their limbs were randomized. So that is, again, a snapshot in time. Everyone is probably thinking like, hey, yeah, you may not see divergent responses in 11 weeks, but over the course of 5 years, maybe I will. In the paper, we kind of go through a couple of these different limitations and kind of give our best faith kind of, okay, well, what kind of data we have on this? And so for the length of the intervention one, some of Dr. Steele's work that has looked at the really long-term training interventions to low-dose resistance training, you would expect to see some of it there. And the variability and the kind of the changes over time was relatively modest compared to these other sources of variation in that data set, which kind of seems to match similar. There's a lot of other limitations there, so I'm not going to hang my hat on that. But in terms of those kind of primary limitations outside of sample size, I think, they're relatively well accounted for. But yeah, really, to me, the main thing is waving that caution flag of making sure we're not misattributing the individual differences to the variability that we're observing. And then I think you had one more question, but I forgot it.
No, you've done a great job. I think I did talk a little bit about like, what we can know from sports science and logistics, but I think you're doing a really good job of making sure that people aren't interpreting what the study can't tell us. And you're saying, listen, hey, we didn't observe, meaningful individual response variation specific to the condition of higher and lower volumes. It was less than other sources of variability that would subsume it. But here's what we did see. We did see that just like the most recent meta-regression by Pellin and colleagues, which Dr. Zourdos called out earlier, we do see that there are higher levels of hypertrophy in response to the higher volume condition. And even though this is a relatively small sample size study, it is sufficiently powered to give us an understanding of, a small sample from that population. Okay, cool, we're seeing something similar. So that gives us an indication, and much of sports science can do this, even though we have relatively small samples, is give us a meaningful, in most cases, representation of how the actual population is going to respond, assuming your methods are done well, and we look at a handful of studies. So you're falling within the bell curve of general responsiveness to volume. That's a good sign. And then what you're saying is, okay, so we didn't find this within participant condition-specific variation. And I'm going to go ahead and accept one of your a priori assumptions that maybe a large source of proposed individual variation is genetics. And that, okay, that is dictating why people tend to have a correlated response between the two arms of the crossover, where they generally respond better to lifting, but not necessarily have like a better or worse response to higher or lower volumes. Okay, genetics is a thing. We'll say that. And we'll go, but, the likelihood that we found every iteration of genetic phenotyping, if we want to call it that, in 16 people, to where maybe someone does have a unique response to higher versus lower volumes, no, I'm not confident that we can say that. So this isn't the definitive, nail in the coffin that says, hey, therefore, volume responsiveness is not a thing. But one thing I really did like about the language in the paper is that you said, however, I think based upon the data we have at this point, perhaps we can have that as the null hypothesis. And what that means for the listener is that our a priori assumption going into future research should perhaps be that there isn't necessarily a large degree that is really meaningful and it's going to subsume other sources of variation, individual by individual, that they will respond in a fundamentally different way or directionality than the typical diminishing returns response that we observed in Pellin to higher and lower volumes. And while that might have been something that I would have struggled with a year or two ago, to be honest, Zach, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this actually makes a ton of sense when we think about which variable we were actually manipulating to examine individual response. It wasn't something that I would describe as qualitative, and this is not a true representation, but I think it gets at the heart of what I'm saying, a qualitative difference between training. It is a quantitative difference in dose. And I know that you have said, hey, almost all variables are dose in disguise, but I think that is a useful way of thinking, but not necessarily a perfect representation. And here's what I'll be really specific, and I want to hear your thoughts on this as kind of our closing thoughts on the inferences we can take in this discussion of your work. To me, it does perhaps make sense, and I could do some hand wavy physiological mechanistic explaining of why, that some people might do better training in, say, the 6 to 8 RM range for their quote-unquote hypertrophy work, while someone else might do better in the 15 to 25 RM range. And that could be truly due to differences in their muscle physiology. But what doesn't make sense to me now that I think about it, and which I think your data supports, is that for some reason, the dose response curve to training generally would differ between people. And I think that actually is a hard pill to swallow when you really think about it. Like, wait a minute, now we're actually saying that we can look at, muscle in a petri dish. We can say, hey, as we turn up mTOR and we turn down AMPK and we do all these things to modify the overall protein balance and anabolic to catabolic signaling balance, you're going to, see better responses. But for you, dear snowflake, for some reason, doing more of the same thing that's good is actually going to flip those directions of those signals, those hormones, and those autocrine paracrine signaling. Because that's what we're really saying when we say, no, you actually do better on 5 sets versus 10 sets because of genetics. So my way of viewing this, as I've seen it now, is that everyone is going to have a same and similar directionality of dose responsiveness, right? But I don't think it's reasonable to assume that you can handle that dose. And in the real world, what we as coaches are potentially observing, and I'm, trying to explain things that I can't, is just that you're capped at where you can handle this amount, and other things are going to become a bottleneck to that being a beneficial decision. And it creates, whether it is due to individual factors or not, an effective cap to how much volume is beneficial for you. But it doesn't necessarily mean that if you could change your environment or whatever, get out of that pollutant area that's going to kill you in 5 years that I talked about earlier, change homes or decide, what, I need to stop having children, that you couldn't maybe have higher volume responsiveness, because that is just the way that we respond to higher doses of a stimulus. And it is even going all the way back to some more kind of fundamental but not perfectly explanatory heuristics and models of understanding adaptation. We're not changing gas for you. Sorry. General adaptation syndrome is not a different animal for you, right? This is the way we understand it to be. The bottleneck is recoverability. The same stimulus that could be, an adaptive response based upon gas also could be non-functional overreaching. But it's not necessarily that there's something wrong with the actual stimulus. It's the same. It's that we got out of the balance of stimulus versus recovery. And it comes back to some of these fundamental concepts we have of balancing those two factors. Do you think I'm off base? Do you think that's an accurate way of describing the limitations of what we can take from your research, and also how it fits in with prior work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good way to frame it. That's a lot of what I've kind of tried to articulate it myself. It's a very similar way of thinking about it. The kind of mental model that I use is just like we started kind of describing the sources of variation with that cauldron analogy. What we're describing that we care about in this kind of theoretical conversation is we're talking about one of those very specific ingredients and the truth of it. We want to know what is the conceptual nature of all these different individuals' dose response curve. And it appears from our research with all the limitations that is a relatively similar construct across individuals. So in this purely theoretical sense, underneath the hood, part of the cauldron of ingredients, those dose response curves may be generalizable, particularly with the dosage variables. We'll touch on the others here in a second. However, that doesn't mean that the other ingredients in the kind of the cauldron don't exist. So like you said, when you factor on all the other things that are going to influence your training, your experience of training, those things can still result in observations that, hey, I'm fatigued when I do very high volumes. Hey, I don't think I can tolerate this. Hey, I don't think I can do this sustainably. All of those things are very real observations, and that doesn't invalidate those from being the case. But I think the shift in perspective that I have had personally as a coach from kind of going through this journey has been, my old kind of framework of coaching is, if anyone's ever kind of seen a 3-dimensional local maxima plot is kind of what it's called, is essentially it's like a map and you're looking for the peak in this 3-dimensional space. That's how I used to think about training prescriptions for an individual, is I'm trying to find in this 3-dimensional space of potential organizations of training variables, where is the local maxima? What is the frequency? What is the relative intensity? What is the loading range? What is the volume that is going to lead to the optimal progress for this individual? The way that I think about it now is more so that the components of the training variables, I'm making the assumption here that this is generalizable to most. We can touch on that in a second. Let's say that it is. I think most of those kind of underlying relationships are probably relatively fixed for the adaptations that we're training with. The thing that's not is all the other variables of your life. And so the thing you're individualizing upon in the real world is this other set of factors. That doesn't mean that individualization is not important. That is the crucial aspect of individual level program design. But the question is, why are we individualizing? What I would have used to been extremely scared of, frankly, would have, if I was having someone doing extremely well with a given level of training volume, and maybe they switch jobs, maybe they have a little extra time, maybe they just frankly want to put more times towards training, I would have been scared to say, hey, we have some more training time. Let's add some more work here. Let's do a little bit of extra, training times, add an extra training day. Because what if I slid off of the local maximal? What if I went away from this kind of constellation of perfect training variables that was eliciting them progress? Whereas the way that I view it now is, if the thing that is kind of constraining those dose response relationships that we kind of understand from each of these variables, if those change, well, I can manipulate my training prescription and probably lead to potentially even better results if those things change in a favorable direction. And that seems like a marginal shift, but for me, that was a pretty big like paradigm shift almost, because it changed my perspective on how to make those training decisions, on one from trying to make sure I've explored this entire three-dimensional space to try to find the perfect thing and I can't deviate from that when I need to thinking much more on a conceptual, logical, and I almost feel I've made better decisions because I'm not handcuffed to these kind of arbitrary principles that I was holding to, that what I think is a fitting in the box of what somebody does well with. And hopefully that's a helpful experience for other people to hear. Maybe I was just kind of thinking about it poorly, but that was my kind of conception of kind of the problem in the optimization game that we were trying to solve. Is I had this three-dimensional space. What's the most efficient way to explore it? How do I detect where I'm at in that three-dimensional space? And then how do I make sure I can repeat that as much as possible for the individual? And I think I view it much more holistically now. And I think personally, it's simplified the training process a lot for the better. And I think it also highlights where research can be really, really advantageous. Ultimately, we're not going to be able to have very robust understandings of what each of these dose response relationships look like if I just, look at my training log from, Monday to Saturday from the last 5 years. I'm still going to have very valuable inferences I can draw from that for my own personal training, but understanding the conceptual nature of the dose response relationships and how that creates a framework for decision making, that's where research really shines. And I think that's kind of the point you were making earlier, is that I am very much on the side of the role of exercise sports science right now, is just helping us quantify and validate those principles as well as we possibly can. One of the reasons I feel that way is I look at other areas of research that are a lot more well-funded. And you mentioned a couple of these places, a couple biostatisticians that I follow in the world of medicine. One of the places that are going to be, if anything is going to have the incentive to really understand this stuff of whether or not I should give a specific individual a drug or not, it's going to be the area of medicine. And often there's a little bit of skepticism with respect to precision medicine and precision approaches to drug prescription in these kind of areas. And they often say that even if there is some potential variability they can quantify, it's very rarely is it actionable. Is it something we can, at baseline diagnostically stratify people out and make a different prescription based on these factors? So it's kind of these multiple hurdles that you have to kind of get past to get into this world where we're able to make these targeted training prescriptions. And so from my perspective, I think we have a really good understanding of these population principles from the limited data that we have. It seems that those, like you said, as kind of the null hypothesis, are probably generalizable at this point in time. I'm very open to changing my mind on that. But that's kind of where it's at right now. And then using your experience to navigate these other kind of external factors to the training intervention to make further manipulations thereof, I think that's a really good framework to kind of operate within. And it leverages both the strengths of what we can do in practice as coaches and also the advantages of research to kind of help us create this framework for decision making that I think just ends us in the place that I think just gets us kind of the best of both worlds, as we're kind of on that.
I love it. I think we've we've covered the full gamut, and I want to say my final piece about, I think, the importance of, or the potential danger or the pitfalls of narratives, even when the action you think you would take might be similar. The possible actions you could take when you have a false narrative can confuse and take you further away from the truth, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And then I want to just give you and Dr. Zourdos a chance for any kind of final closing words as well, and maybe what the future holds or where you think the future should go in this area of sports science, because Dr. Z has been struggling with storm-related internet access, so I know he hasn't had the opportunity to contribute quite as much, but I'm sure he'll have some final closing words. But I'll just say that I think a really important thing to acknowledge here is that our observations and our inferences as coaches and what we do in the real world, or if we're training ourselves, nothing has fundamentally changed. The things we see are real because they have been observed. But the narratives we have and the explanations behind them have always, and now still continue to be, even with this data, a guess. And the thing that has changed, though, is what level of a priori assumptions and what level of confidence do we have in the potential guesses that we put forth and the narratives we put behind them. And if we start with the assumption that people do fundamentally differ in how they respond to these key variables, and that some people, they respond better from the 1 to 4 set range, and they have this inverse relationship as they go from 5 to 20 sets, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller the more resistance training they do, that means there's a boogeyman. It's not just an inverted U that we are potentially dealing with, but the stark drop-off, and you could apply that to any variable. Or that if there are these fundamental genetic differences that truly change the shape of our response to training or nutrition broadly, that some people need to be on a ketogenic diet to make any progress, and other people need to be on a high-carb, low-fat diet. It doesn't map with what we understand in other fields. You were talking about biostatistics. Like, it's absolutely true that some people can't metabolize phenylalanine to the same degree, and they need to be careful with diet soda intake. That's a thing. But it's also a very small percentage of people. It's a very narrow application. And there's a very obvious thing you need to do with that is, don't consume that thing you don't have the ability to actually enzymatic the process. Or like if you have a dairy allergy, like we can think of many examples where there absolutely are genetic true individual differences, but they're not necessarily changing the way you would actually respond to dairy if you simply didn't have an allergy to it. You're just getting an immune response. And that narrative is a bit different if you think about the parallel in training. So I guess what I'm saying to the coaches are that you still are going to respond to what you see, control as many variables as you can, you make changes, and you're going to see whether or not those changes are repeatable or whether they're just what's going on right now for whatever reason. You can absolutely make your best guess as to maybe why it is that, because that's going to tell you what maybe the best intervention is. And you may be right, you may be wrong, but you just have to accept that ultimately you respond to what you see and you make cautious interpretations as to potentially why, only in service of making a decision, not just to feel smart about it or to feel safer in the world because you can explain the things you observe, which I think is what a lot of us humans do, because that's how we feel safe existentially. And if you can be comfortable chasing consistent response, and not necessarily knowing or needing to explain why you're observing what you're seeing, unless it's, to get buy-in or give a client confidence, then you'll be fine. But that's really no different than what you did previously. And having this perspective might even make you be more rigorous in the way that you assess these things, because you become agnostic as to the cause, but you become dedicated to actually observing true change. And that is what's going to make you a better coach. So I think I will leave people with that, and I'll say my personal view of maybe where we should be going with sports science now is accepting that, man, we are inheritors from medical science and from a lot of other fields. We've cobbled together makeshift theories, and we are in the middle of a replication crisis, probably because of some of those factors. And there are many things we really do not understand in our fundamental understanding of things. If we go all the way back to, Herzog and other like initial studies, they're based upon like N of 6 things and some frog studies. And we do think we have a basic idea of the way physiology works. But in the context of exercise and sports science, we still have big questions that need to be answered with large-scale population data and the type of work that is actually repeating what other people did instead of trying to find our own unique spin and novelty in our sum of 6-person study that we did in a university. So we need to actually really strengthen our foundations and understand the directionality of these relationships at the population level. And there's a lot left to be done here. So maybe the role of sports science isn't to try to figure out how to get these personalized approaches to individual response like we thought we were on the cusp of, but rather to rebolster the foundations of our field so that we have a really clear idea of responsiveness generally. So we know which levers to pull, when, and why, and then it gives us more confidence to simply chase the observations we have as practitioners. So that's my view of what we should do. But Zac, I want to hear it from you. Where do we go from here? You know, you're now going to be one of the giants who someone else stands on the shoulders of. Where do you want to see them going?
Yeah, so I mean, this is tons of different kind of rabbit holes that could go down. Ultimately, I would say as far as the individual response stuff goes, I think, kind of validating this principle or lack thereof in kind of multiple other training variables, specifically ones that I think are, in my opinion, a little bit more likely to kind of show it than other ones. Like the area of biomechanics, I think how that interacts with different exercises, for example, I think that is a much stronger potential candidate here. And shout out to one of your PhD students, Christian Amdi, who's kind of doing some work on this in the area of powerlifting and exercise selection, which I think is an interesting kind of candidate. But that kind of realm of things and just kind of seeing additional attempts at some sorts of designs with replication, I think would give us kind of a better understanding of how generalizable is the findings of this study, and just kind of in general could kind of peel back the curtain a little bit more to kind of see what we're looking at. The other obvious thing is with the advancement of AI and some of these other approaches, some will be the proponents of that and say that that's going to give us the ability to make predictions that no other tools will. And I'm not an AI expert by any means, but I know other kind of more traditional researchers and people who are really, really focused on, the causal explanations to these types of things, think that those types of approaches can have some limitations that may not always be able to be answered by more and more and more data. Sometimes the quality of the data is the limitation, or the nature of the data, as opposed to just getting more and more and more of it, and kind of shifting from a predictive or a descriptive kind of lens of inference to something that's more explanatory or causal. That's kind of a big argument you can kind of get into depending on the lens of research that you come from. So those are kind of the two areas that I'm interested in this kind of topic, is, obviously more kind of replicated designs, just to hopefully kind of peel back the curtain more. And then also just the exploration of these other types of technologies, other ways of attacking this question, and just looking at things like that. But outside of that, I think you're spot on in terms of, I think the role of a coach and their frame of reference and the way that they make decisions. I don't think that really should change. It's just the kind of operating system. If you were to use kind of computer technology, maybe it gets a slight update in terms of why am I making a certain decision and how does that influence the way I make decisions in the future. At least that's the way that I view it for myself. Again, viewing it from that, what is the golden star training program for this individual? I think is based on real observations, and that can lead to still very good progression for an individual. But I think in kind of the future prescriptive sense, it can potentially lead to decisions that are maybe a little bit counterintuitive, at least from my standpoint now, is kind of how I view it. So I think it's just a very slight shift in the framework, which is ironic. More research is needed. Throw all the caveats and the cliches on there, but it really isn't a massive practical shift, but it's more so just a framework of understanding, a caution flag going forward, and ultimately just kind of trying to be epistemically humble with what we can know from any given set of data is kind of the main takeaways for me, and kind of what's next.
Awesome. Dr. Zourdos, you haven't been struck by lightning. You're back with us. Final words from you to close out this episode, because you are the one who's hosted, this research at your lab.
As far as you know, I haven't been struck by lightning. So
Well, you're looking good if you have been. So well done. Yeah.
I'm always looking good, despite your quip about my arm size earlier today. Nonetheless, a few things very quickly. One, Zac mentioned the concept of biomechanics, and I imagine some are out there and are thinking, well, okay, but I have some people that just aren't built to do this exercise. And I think it's important to clarify the difference between the acute baseline structural difference, let's say, in biomechanics or femur length or ankle mobility or whatever it is, versus the long-term response. So, for example, if we carry out a study and in that study you notice that somebody gains, they're squatting multiple times per week, and somebody increases their muscle size by 15%, and somebody else that has terrible leverages for squatting increases their muscle size by only 2% or 1%, and it was using high volume protocols, you might say this person needs to use lower volume. I would say to that is that, maybe, but there's still, as you mentioned earlier, Eric, the same dose response curve for this person. It's just that if they were doing 10 sets per week, for them, 2 sets is probably going to be better than 1 set, but they might cap out their response magnitude of actionable or meaningful difference at 4 sets because they're simply not built for that. But if you were to carry out another study looking at increases in quad size using a leg extension, and you were to fit each person specifically to the machine or have a machine that works, because even machine-based training still can result in differences in terms of the biomechanics and somebody's limb lengths. And so you have them fit perfectly to the machine for how their body is structured. In that case, the null or the expectation would be more in line with the population averages that both people would grow with those 15 sets. So I think it's important to point that out. I would also note a few kind of super quick hits. One, and Eric did a great job of mentioning this, I think everybody should, and this is really a note for young researchers out there, note the caution that Zac went about talking about this topic. And even in the paper, right? In the paper, he says, it is crucial to clarify that this study does not argue against the individualization of resistance training programs, right? He talks and mentions about and goes on to discuss that there's limited empirical support, that everyone should continue to individualize. Maybe why we're individualizing is in question. And what I think this paper does and this study does, it actually helps, almost ironically, with the individualization. And Zac, you mentioned this earlier in your own training. Before, you would have been reluctant to pull back on that high volume for that person because you would have said at the time, perhaps they were a responder to high volume. Now you're seeing everything else they have going on in their life, and you say that, sure, if everything else is perfect, ideally they would do 20 sets per week. But I know from looking at what's going on in their life, they're not going to be able to recover and sustain that. So I am going to pull them back to 10 sets. And I do think they'll get a better response, if you will, now because of that. So in a way, it can help with the individualization even more. And then kind of some of the last kind of things I'll say here to answer your question directly, Dr. Helms, which is, what is the role of sports science here and what are we trying to accomplish? And I would say that there's 2 things, or a couple things I want to hit on. First, you mentioned this, our field is very young. And by our field, I don't just mean exercise science. I mean resistance training, specific hypertrophy strength type studies. These studies were non-existent. sliding filament theory was really, uncovered by Huxley. We're talking 70-ish years ago now, when we looked at that and we talked about that, published in Nature. And so our field is very, very young. Aerobic training research has been around, more since the early part of the 20th century. And so we're just getting into it in this field. Dr. Helms, you and I have been in research now, myself since 2008, you around that time-ish as well. And it's a world of difference. Of course, people like Zac have risen the bar in terms of statistical modeling, but I've seen the gradual increase in terms of the quality of work, and the number of papers coming out is astronomical. So things are going to continue to change and so forth. But I viewed the role here as being able to explain and develop concepts, not at all ever of being able to tell somebody how to train, right? Our goal, as a coach, I would always say to a coach, do you want to be known as smart or do you want to be known as a good coach? Right? It's like when I watch a comedian, is that comedian trying to be known as smart, or is he or she trying to be funny? Right? If they're trying to be funny, they have no problem when you think they're stupid on stage. Right? And coaches shouldn't strive to be looked at as stupid, of course, but the point is they shouldn't be out there saying, hey, I want to describe everything that's going on. They should be out there saying, I know how to get results generally based upon this data. So we should be here to find concepts. And I think this paper is helping to find this concept, but in no way should it tell somebody how to train. Rather, it say, hey, generally, these other things do seem to affect how people may respond at times, these external factors to the training intervention. Don't be afraid to adjust training as you see fit when some of those factors pop up. And I think that is a very important concept of this, and integrating these concepts with other things together. You can do that and then still on top of that, auto-regulate the training, right? Because you can say, hey, generally, wow, this person, right, they just had a child, they just started a new job, whatever it's going on, they have this external, they're in their friend group, there's some sort of, strife going on, they're constantly thinking about that, there's some sort of stress, I'm going to pull back a little bit, but then they go in the gym and they happen to feel great one day. Okay, well, you're going to push to a 0 RIR instead of a 3 RIR, perhaps get a little bit more out of it, and you're still going to incorporate auto-regulation there. So our job is to continue to look at these concepts and so forth. And one thing I think, the last thing I'll say on resistance training research is that we tend to get in these camps of this, so I respond to high volume or I respond to low volume, or to continue to pile on Zac here today, I have to train to failure or not train to failure, as he famously lit up the internet a few years ago now, is that the consequences, right, for doing the other thing and not doing as well are so low. In terms of if you do low volume or you do high volume, you're going to get better either way. And we can argue the merits of if one is better than the other or so forth. If you train to failure or not failure, you're going to get gains either way. And if you leave a little bit on the table, you might not realize you left a little bit on the table, but the consequences of getting 2% less muscle growth are non-existent in the real world. Except if you're a WNBF bodybuilder, Dr. Helms, my apologies. The consequences of prescribing somebody the wrong dose of medicine can be potentially catastrophic. And so to the point earlier of where this goes, right, those are the areas where it's actually important. It's really not that important for what we're doing, because no matter what you do and what you train, as long as it's generally good, you're going to get gains. So our job is to display these concepts. Our job is to be cautious and allow coaches to take these concepts, and we need to give them the agency to put it in practice using their experience. And that's the most important thing that we can do. And I look forward to other areas taking on the study design that Zac used today to identify if this does or doesn't exist to the best they can, to actually be able to make good prescriptions in fields where it really, really matters.
Well said. And I think a great set of closing comments there, Mike. And I think you really kind of highlighted some of the things that both myself and Zac brought up, gave some really great examples. And I just appreciate both of you guys. Dr. Robinson, you did a fantastic job with your dissertation research, and I know it was a grueling challenge. Dr. Zourdos, you've done a fantastic job creating an environment that incubates these leaders that we have to come forward. And Zac, I think you're also doing a really, really good job. And I want everyone to check out Data-Driven Strength, you guys' YouTube channel, as well as your podcast, communicating this stuff. And if anyone wants deeper dives, oh boy, you can get them there. So I will say thank you to everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture presented by Mass. Please do give us the likes, the subscribes, the high ratings. That's 5 stars, folks. And make sure you check in next week. It'll probably be me and Trex back with a live episode. But this has been a fantastic discussion with Dr. Zac Robinson, and I will see you all next week.